The blizzard had buried Millbrook under 3 feet of snow, and while the entire town waited for rescue, Karen Whitmore stood defiantly in her driveway at 3 a.m., arms crossed, blocking the massive snowplow that could save them all. "You're not touching my property," she screamed into the howling wind. But what Karen didn't know was that her neighbor's 7-year-old daughter was fighting for her life just blocks away, and the ambulance couldn't get through. In 24 hours, this woman's stubborn pride would cost her everything she thought she was protecting. The first flakes began falling at 2:47 p.m. on Thursday, February 15th, just as Karen Whitmore was arranging her pristine collection of garden gnomes for the 3rd time that week. She watched from her bay window as the snow drifted down like powdered sugar, coating her immaculate front lawn in Millbrook's most exclusive neighborhood, Maple Heights. "Harold," she called to her husband, who was hunched over his laptop in the home office. The weather service said light flurries. "This doesn't look light." Harold Whitmore, a mild-mannered insurance adjuster who had learned over their 23 years of marriage to navigate his wife's particular brand of vigilance, peered over his reading glasses. "It's just snow, Karen. February in New England. What did you expect?" But Karen was already reaching for her phone, scrolling through the neighborhood Facebook group she administered with the iron fist of a small-town dictator. The Maple Heights Homeowners Association page had 847 members, and Karen knew every single one of their property values, HOA violations, and personal grievances. "I'm posting a reminder about snow removal responsibilities," she announced, her fingers flying across the screen. "People need to understand that the city has no right to dump snow on private property without permission." Harold sighed. They'd had this conversation every winter for the past 5 years, ever since Karen had declared war on the city's snow removal practices. It had started with a simple complaint about a plow scraping her decorative mailbox post. But like most things with Karen, it had evolved into something much larger, much more personal. The post went live at 3:15 p.m. "Attention Maple Heights residents, as we prepare for tonight's snowfall, please remember that city snowplows do not have the right to deposit snow on your private property without explicit permission. This includes the area between the sidewalk and street, which many of you mistakenly believe is city property. I will be monitoring the situation closely and documenting any violations. Know your rights." Karen Whitmore, HOA president. Within minutes, the comments began flooding in. "Here we go again." A Mike Patterson from Elm Street. "Karen, that's not how snow removal works." Sarah Chen, clearly trying to be diplomatic. "Maybe we should focus on staying safe instead of property lines." Janet Miller, the elementary school teacher who lived 2 blocks over, but Karen was already composing her response, her manicured fingers stabbing at the keyboard with increasing intensity. She had researched this extensively. She knew her rights. The strip of grass between her sidewalk and the street might technically be a city easement, but it was part of her property. Taxes, part of her responsibility to maintain. And she'd be damned if she was going to let some city worker with a plow destroy the professional landscaping she'd spent $3,000 on last spring. By 4:30 p.m., the snow was falling harder. The Weather Service had upgraded their forecast to a winter storm warning, with accumulations of 18 to 24 inches expected overnight. Harold had given up trying to reason with his wife and retreated to the basement to check their emergency supplies. Karen, meanwhile, had moved to the living room window, which provided a perfect view of her front lawn and the street beyond. She'd positioned herself in her favorite armchair, a burgundy leather recliner that Harold had bought her for Christmas, with her laptop balanced on her knees and her phone within easy reach. At 5:45 p.m., she spotted the first city truck making its way down Maple Avenue, the main thoroughfare that connected their neighborhood to the rest of Millbrook. It was just a preliminary run, salting the roads before the real accumulation began. But Karen was already on high alert. She called the city's public works department. "This is Karen Whitmore at 1247 Maple Avenue," she said when a tired-sounding woman answered. "I'm calling to formally notify you that I do not consent to having snow deposited on my property during tonight's storm. I want this documented." There was a pause. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The plows need to clear the streets for emergency vehicles." "I understand that," Karen interrupted. "But they need to do it without damaging or dumping snow on private property. I've researched the city ordinances and property owners have rights." Let me transfer you to my supervisor. Karen waited on hold for 12 minutes, during which time she watched the snow continue to fall with increasing intensity. The flakes were smaller now, denser, the kind that would pack down hard and be difficult to remove. "This is Tom Bradley. Public Works Supervisor," came a gruff voice. "I understand you have concerns about snow removal." "Mr. Bradley, I'm calling to inform you that I do not consent to having snow from city streets deposited on my property. I want this conversation recorded, and I want written confirmation that your crews will respect private property boundaries." Tom Bradley had been working for the city for 26 years. He dealt with difficult residents before, but something in Karen's tone set off warning bells. With all due respect, during a major storm like this, our priority is keeping the roads clear for emergency vehicles. We can't work around individual property concerns. Then you'll be hearing from my lawyer. Karen hung up and immediately called her attorney, Richard Morse, who specialized in property disputes and had helped her win a boundary disagreement with her neighbor 2 years prior. "Richard, I need you to draft a cease and desist letter to the city," she said without preamble. "They are planning to violate my property rights tonight." "Karen, it's nearly 6 p.m. and there's a major storm coming. Can't this wait until—" "No, it cannot wait. I pay you to protect my interests, not to make excuses." While Karen was on the phone with her lawyer, her neighbor across the street, Maria Santos, was dealing with her own crisis. Her 7-year-old daughter, Isabella, had been fighting a respiratory infection for 3 days, and despite the antibiotics, her condition was worsening. "Mommy, I can't breathe good," Isabella whispered from her bed, her small chest rising and falling with obvious effort. Maria pressed her hand to her daughter's forehead. The fever was getting worse. She'd been monitoring Isabella's breathing all day, and the wheezing was becoming more pronounced. As a single mother working 2 jobs to afford their modest home on the opposite side of Maple Heights, Maria didn't have the luxury of being overly cautious about medical expenses. But something in her daughter's labored breathing made her stomach clench with fear. She called their pediatrician's after-hours line. "Given the respiratory distress you're describing, especially with the fever spiking, I think you should bring her to the emergency room tonight," Dr. Peterson said. "It could be developing into pneumonia." Maria looked out her window at the rapidly accumulating snow. Her neighborhood was on the far side of Maple Heights, where the streets were narrower. And the city plows always came later. But the hospital was only 12 blocks away, mostly along main roads that would be cleared first. "I can make it," she told herself, bundling Isabella in warm blankets. "We'll be fine." At 7:30 p.m., as Maria was loading her daughter into their 15-year-old Honda Civic, Karen was positioning herself by her front window with a thermos of coffee and her camera phone. She'd received Richard's hastily drafted cease and desist letter via email and printed 3 copies, one for herself, one for the first plow operator she encountered, and one for the police if necessary. The snow was now falling so heavily that Karen could barely see the streetlight at the end of her driveway. But she could hear the distant rumble of heavy machinery, the sound of the city's snow removal operation gearing up for what was clearly going to be an all-night battle. "Harold," she called. "They are starting. I'm going to need you to witness this." Harold emerged from the basement, carrying a battery-powered radio and a flashlight. "The power's starting to flicker," he said. "Maybe we should focus on staying warm instead of, this is about principle," Karen cut him off. "If we don't stand up for our rights, who will?" At 8:15 p.m., the first plow turned onto Maple Avenue. Karen was ready. She threw on her heavy winter coat, grabbed her printed cease and desist letter, and marched out into the storm. The snow was already 6 inches deep and falling harder by the minute. The plow was still 2 blocks away, but Karen positioned herself at the end of her driveway, right where the city easement met her property line. The plow operator, a 24-year-old named Danny Rodriguez who was working his first winter with the city, saw the figure standing in the snow and slowed down. It was unusual for anyone to be outside in conditions like this, let alone standing in the middle of the street. He rolled down his window as he approached. "You need to get out of the road. This is dangerous." Karen stepped closer, holding up her letter. "I'm Karen Whitmore, and I'm informing you that you do not have permission Danny Rodriguez sat in his plow truck, engine idling, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the relentless snow. Through his radio, he could hear the controlled chaos of the city's emergency operations center, reports of accidents, power outages and mounting accumulations throughout Millbrook. And here he was, stuck on Maple Avenue, staring at a woman who seemed to believe her property rights trumped a natural disaster. Unit 7, what's your status? Came Tom Bradley's voice through the static. I've got a situation here, Tom. Resident blocking the plow says she's got legal papers. There was a pause. Legal papers? Some kind of cease and desist thing. She's standing right in front of me. Karen could hear the radio conversation and felt vindicated. This was exactly why she'd prepared. While her neighbors slept peacefully, assuming the city would handle everything, she was protecting all of their rights. Tom, this is Karen Whitmore, she called out loudly enough for the radio to pick up. I spoke with you earlier. I'm exercising my legal right to protect my property. Through the radio, they heard Tom Bradley's exasperated sigh. Danny, just to document it and move on. We've got the whole city to clear. Move on where? Danny asked, gesturing at the narrow street. She's blocking the only way through. Karen stepped closer to the truck, her boots crunching in the snow. Young man, I'm not trying to make your job difficult. But I spent $3,000 on professional landscaping last spring, and I'm not going to let the city destroy it. Because of poor planning. Lady, it's a snowstorm, Danny said, his patience wearing thin. Your landscaping is already under a foot of snow. That's temporary. Your plow damage would be permanent. Meanwhile, 6 blocks away, Maria Santos was learning that temporary and permanent had different meanings when your child couldn't breathe. Her Honda had made it exactly 4 blocks before the combination of accumulating snow and her worn tires had left her stranded in the middle of Cedar Street. Isabella's breathing had become more labored during the short drive. Each inhalation was a struggle, and her fever-bright eyes were wide with fear. Mommy, why did we stop? Isabella whispered. Just a little problem with the car, Major. We'll be moving soon. Maria tried the engine again. The wheel spun uselessly in the snow. She could see the main road ahead, Maple Avenue, where the plows would come first. If she could just get there, they could follow the cleared path to the hospital. She called 911. 911, what's your emergency? My daughter, she's having trouble breathing. I was trying to get her to the hospital, but my car is stuck in the snow. What's your location? Cedar Street, between Maple and Oak. We are about 6 blocks from Millbrook General. I'm going to dispatch an ambulance, but you need to understand, response times are significantly delayed due to the storm. Are you in immediate danger? Maria looked at Isabella, whose lips were taking on a bluish tint. Yes. Yes, I think we are. Stay on the line. I'm dispatching now. The 911 operator, Janet Williams, had been handling emergency calls for 15 years. She'd worked through hurricanes, ice storms, and blizzards, but this storm was different. The snow was falling too fast for the plows to keep up, and they already had 3 ambulances stuck in various parts of the city. Unit 23, we need you to respond to Cedar Street for a pediatric respiratory emergency, she radioed. Janet, Unit 23 is currently stuck behind a resident blocking the plow on Maple Avenue. We can't get through. Janet felt her stomach drop. What do you mean blocking the plow? Some woman with legal papers. She won't let the plow clear the street. Back on Maple Avenue, Karen was explaining property law to Danny Rodriguez while Harold stood in their doorway, watching his wife with growing unease. The city easement, Karen was saying, only grants the right of passage, not the right to deposit materials. If you need to clear the street, you need to find a way to do it that doesn't damage or dump snow on private property. Lady, that's not how snow removal works, Danny said. I push it to the sides. That's literally the only way to clear a street. Then you need better equipment. Danny's radio crackled. Unit 7, we need you to clear that street immediately. We have an ambulance trying to get through for a medical emergency. Karen's expression didn't change. Medical emergency or not, the law is the law. Did you hear that? There's an ambulance, I heard it. And I'm sure they'll find another route. But there was no other route. Cedar Street was a dead end that only connected to Maple Avenue. The ambulance was trapped behind the plow, which was trapped behind Karen's stubborn interpretation of property rights. At 9:23 p.m., Dr. Sarah Kim was finishing her shift at Millbrook General's emergency department when she received the call about the trapped ambulance. How long have they been stuck, she asked. 47 minutes and counting, came the reply. It's a 7-year-old with respiratory distress. The EMTs are with her now, but they can't get to the hospital. Dr. Kim had treated hundreds of children with respiratory infections. She knew that for most kids it was manageable with proper treatment. But she also knew that in severe cases, especially with high fever and increasing distress, time was everything. Can they treat her in the ambulance? They are doing what they can, but she needs hospital care. For antibiotics, respiratory support, possibly more. Dr. Kim looked out at the storm, which showed no signs of letting up. What about the plow situation? Still ongoing. The resident won't budge. In the ambulance, EMT Marcus Thompson was watching Isabella's oxygen saturation levels drop. He'd been a paramedic for 12 years and he knew when a situation was turning critical. Maria, I need you to stay calm, he said to the girl's mother. Isabella's condition is worsening and we need to get her to the hospital as quickly as possible. But we are stuck, Maria said, her voice breaking. The snow. Oh no. But my partner is working on it. His partner, Jennifer Walsh, was indeed working on it. She'd walked through the snow to the front of the line, where she found Danny Rodriguez still facing off with Karen Whitmore. I'm EMT Walsh. We have a critically ill 7-year-old in the ambulance behind us. She needs to get to the hospital immediately. Karen looked at the young woman in the EMT uniform, snow covering her shoulders and concern etched on her face. For a moment, something flickered in Karen's expression, a hint of uncertainty. Oh. I'm sorry about the child, Karen said. But medical emergencies don't negate property rights. The city needs to find another way. There is no other way, Jennifer said, her professional composure cracking. This is the only route. That little girl could die. That's not my fault. Karen replied, but her voice was less certain than before. I'm not the one who failed to plan for snow removal that respects private property. Jennifer stared at her in disbelief. You're going to let a child die to prove a point about your lawn? I'm protecting everyone's rights, Karen said, but she was looking at the ground now, not meeting Jennifer's eyes. Behind them, the line of vehicles was growing. More residents were returning home from work, trying to beat the storm. The city's other plow trucks were spread thin across Millbrook, dealing with their own emergencies and obstacles. Harold Whitmore had been watching from their doorway, but now he walked out into the storm. Karen, he said quietly. Maybe we should. Don't, Karen cut him off. Don't you dare undermine me now. This is important. More important than a child's life. Karen whirled to face him. It's not about the child. It's about principle. If we give in now, every time there's an emergency, they'll just ignore our rights. Where does it end, Harold? But as she spoke, she could see the flashing lights of the ambulance reflecting off the snow, could see the EMT's face, could feel the weight of every person trapped behind her personal stand. At 10:15 p.m., Isabella Santos lost consciousness. She's going into respiratory failure, Marcus Thompson reported over the radio. We need to get to the hospital now, or we are going to lose her. The radio call was heard by every emergency vehicle in the city, including the fire department, police, and Tom Bradley in the public works office. Within minutes, Karen's phone was ringing. This is Mayor Patterson, came the voice when she answered. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to step aside immediately. Mayor Patterson, I'm exercising my legal rights as a property owner, Mrs. Whitmore, a 7-year-old girl is dying. I'm ordering you to move. You don't have the authority to order me off my own property. I'm declaring a state of emergency. I absolutely have that authority. Karen felt the first crack in her certainty. A state of emergency. For snow removal. But as she looked around at the line of vehicles, the flashing lights, the EMT standing in the snow pleading with her, she realized that this had grown beyond anything she'd anticipated. "Oh. I need to call my lawyer," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore, there's no time. That little girl needs medical attention right now." Behind Karen, Harold was already walking toward the house. "I'm getting the car keys," he called back to her. "We are moving our cars out of the driveway." "Harold, no. You can't just," but Harold was done. "Karen, I've supported you through a lot of things, but I won't have a child's death on my conscience." As Harold moved their vehicles, Karen stood alone in the snow, still clutching her cease and desist letter. The plow truck was idling, waiting. The ambulance lights were flash. Karen stood in the swirling snow, her printed cease and desist letter growing soggy in her trembling hands. The weight of a dozen pairs of eyes pressed down on her, Danny Rodriguez in his plow truck, EMT Jennifer Walsh with snow melting on her uniform, neighbors who had emerged from their houses to witness the standoff, and Harold, who was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Disappointment. Pure, undiluted disappointment. "Karen," Harold said quietly, snow accumulating on his shoulders. "I'm begging you. Please." But Karen's mind was racing through 23 years of marriage, 5 years of homeowner association battles, and a lifetime of being told she was too demanding, too particular, too much. She'd fought for every inch of respect she'd ever received. She'd documented every slight, researched every ordinance, and stood her ground when everyone else just rolled over. "I'm not the villain here," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm protecting all of our rights." "Whose rights?" Harold asked. "The rights of the little girl who can't breathe." In the ambulance, Isabella Santos was turning blue. Marcus Thompson had seen children die before. It was the part of his job that haunted him, the cases that made him question whether he was strong enough to keep doing this work. But he'd never lost a child because someone wouldn't move out of the way. "Her oxygen set is dropping fast," he radioed to the hospital. "We need to intubate, but I need a clear path to get her to you." "Marcus, how long can you keep her stable?" Dr. Kim's voice crackled through the radio. "Not long. Maybe 10 minutes before we lose her completely." Dr. Kim closed her eyes. 10 minutes. A 7-year-old girl had 10 minutes to live, and it all depended on whether one woman would step aside. "Unit 7, this is Dr. Kim at Millbrook General. Put me through to the woman blocking the plow." Danny Rodriguez looked at Karen, who was now visibly shaking. "Lady, the doctor wants to talk to you." Karen took the radio with numb fingers. "This is Karen Whitmore." "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Dr. Sarah Kim. I'm the emergency physician waiting for Isabella Santos. She's 7 years old and she's dying. I need you to understand she has minutes, not hours. If that ambulance doesn't get here soon, she will die. Do you understand me?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper. "I understand." "Then please move aside." "Oh." Karen looked around at the faces staring at her. "I can't just. If I give in now, what's to stop them from?" "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Kim interrupted. "What's to stop you from living with the death of a child for the rest of your life?" The radio went silent except for the static of the storm. Jennifer Walsh stepped closer to Karen. "Her name is Isabella," she said. "She's 7 years old. She likes to draw pictures of butterflies. Her mom works 2 jobs to support them. She's scared and she's dying, and you're the only thing standing between her and help." Karen looked at the EMT's face, saw the tears mixing with melted snow on her cheeks. "Oh. I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Jennifer said. "You wanted to be right more than you wanted to be human." The words hit Karen like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her cease and desist letter fluttering to the ground where it was immediately covered by fresh snow. "That's not. I'm not." Karen's voice broke. "I'm not a monster." "Then prove it," Harold said, walking toward her. "Karen, I love you. I've loved you through every fight, every battle, every principle you've stood for. But I won't love you through this. If that little girl dies because you wouldn't move, I'm done. Karen stared at her husband, the man who had supported her through every HOA meeting, every property dispute, every moment when the rest of the world told her she was wrong. Harold, you can't mean that. I mean it, he said, and his voice was steady as stone. Choose, Karen. Your principles or your family. Behind them, the line of trapped vehicles had grown longer. Other residents of Maple Heights had come outside, drawn by the flashing lights and the unusual commotion. They stood in their driveways, some still in their pajamas, watching their HOA president face the consequences of her rigid worldview. She's actually going to let that child die, whispered Janet Miller, the elementary school teacher who had tried to reason with Karen on Facebook hours earlier. I always knew she was difficult, said Mike Patterson, but this is insane. Someone needs to do something, said Sarah Chen, pulling out her phone. I'm calling Channel 7. The whole city needs to see this. But Karen heard none of the whispers. She was remembering Isabella's mother, Maria Santos, who had attended exactly one HOA meeting in the 3 years she'd lived in the neighborhood. Maria had sat quietly in the back, never speaking up, never complaining about the assessments or the parking restrictions or any of the dozen small battles that Karen fought on everyone's behalf. What did you say the little girl's name was? Karen asked Jennifer. Isabella. Isabella Santos. 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 Karen's mind struggled to place the name. She lives on Cedar Street. Yes. Karen remembered now. The quiet woman who always paid her HOA dues on time, who kept her modest lawn neat, who never caused problems. The woman who had once approached Karen after a meeting to quietly ask if there was a payment plan for a special assessment because money was tight. She's one of my neighbors, Karen said, the realization hitting her like a sledgehammer. She's one of your neighbors, Jennifer confirmed. And she's dying. At 10:47 p.m., Isabella Santos flatlined. The sharp, continuous beep of the monitor cut through the storm like a scream. Marcus Thompson immediately began CPR, his hands working frantically on the small chest. She's in cardiac arrest, he radioed. We are doing CPR, but she needs a hospital now. The radio transmission was heard by everyone, the plow operator, the police, the fire department, and Karen Whitmore, who stood frozen in the snow as the weight of what was happening finally, truly hit her. Oh God, she whispered. Oh God. What have I done? But even as the words left her mouth, she didn't move. 23 years of marriage, 5 years of battles, and a lifetime of being right had created grooves in her mind too deep to escape from easily. Mrs. Whitmore, came Dr. Kim's voice over the radio, they are doing CPR. Every second counts. Karen looked at Harold, who was watching her with an expression of absolute despair. She looked at Jennifer Walsh, who was openly crying. She looked at Danny Rodriguez, who was gripping his steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. And then she looked at her house, her perfect house with its perfect lawn and its perfect landscaping and its perfect property lines. The house that had defined her, that had given her purpose, that had made her feel important and respected. And right. I just wanted to protect what's mine, she said, and her voice was lost in the wind. It's not yours, Harold said quietly. None of it is yours. We are all just borrowing everything, Karen. All of it. In the ambulance, Marcus Thompson was working frantically to restart Isabella's heart. He'd been doing CPR for 3 minutes. And he knew that brain damage became increasingly likely with each passing second. Come on, baby, he whispered. Come on, Isabella. Don't give up on me. The monitor showed a brief flutter, then flatlined again. She's not responding, he radioed. We are losing her. The words echoed through the emergency radio network and reached Karen's ears like a death sentence. Not for Isabella, for herself. Oh. Karen started to speak, then stopped. She closed her eyes, feeling the snow on her face, hearing the wind and the radio static and the sound of her own heartbeat. When she opened her eyes, she was looking directly at her house, at the bay window where she'd spent so many hours watching, planning, protecting. And for the first time in years, she saw it clearly. It was just a house. Just wood and brick and glass. Just a place to live. But Isabella Santos was a person. A 7-year-old person with butterfly drawings and a mother who worked 2 jobs. And a whole life ahead of her. Karen took a step toward the side of the road. Then another. Then she looked at Danny Rodriguez and said, "Go. Go." Karen screamed, waving her arms. "Go. Get her to the hospital." Danny Rodriguez didn't wait for a second invitation. He threw his plow into gear and began pushing forward, creating a path through the snow. Behind him, the ambulance immediately followed, its sirens wailing as it raced toward Millbrook General. Karen stood in the snow, watching the lights disappear into the storm. She felt Harold's hand on her shoulder, but she couldn't look at him. She couldn't look at anyone. "Karen," Harold said softly. "You did the right thing." "I almost didn't," she whispered. "I almost let her die." "But you didn't." "But I almost did." At 11:02 p.m., the ambulance arrived at Millbrook General Hospital. Isabella Santos was rushed into the emergency room, where Dr. Kim and her team immediately began working to save her life. At 11:03 p.m., Karen Whitmore walked into her perfect house, sat down at her perfect kitchen table, and began to understand the difference between being right and being human. The storm was far from over, and the hardest part was yet to come. Karen sat at her kitchen table, staring at her hands. They were still shaking. Harold had gone upstairs without a word, and she could hear him moving around in their bedroom, opening drawers, closing them, the sound of the closet door. Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number: "You almost killed a child. I hope you're proud of yourself." Another buzz: "Saw the news. You're a monster." Another: "How do you sleep at night?" Karen looked at the screen in confusion. What news? She hadn't spoken to any reporters. But then she remembered Sarah Chen with her phone, the growing crowd of neighbors, the way everyone had been watching. She turned on the local news and immediately saw herself on screen, a grainy cell phone video of her standing in the snow, arms crossed, while an ambulance sat trapped behind her. The reporter was in the studio, and the story was the lead. Tonight, a Millbrook woman blocked city snowplows for over an hour, preventing an ambulance from reaching a critically ill 7-year-old girl. The child, Isabella Santos, went into cardiac arrest during the delay and is currently in critical condition at Millbrook General Hospital. Karen's legs gave out. She sank into her chair as the reality hit her. The whole city knew. The whole city had watched her nearly let a child die over property rights. The news report continued. The incident began when Karen Whitmore, president of the Maple Heights Homeowners Association, refused to allow snowplows to clear her street, citing property rights concerns. Emergency responders were trapped behind the blocked plow for over an hour while the child's condition deteriorated. Her phone rang. Channel 7 News. It rang again. The Millbrook Daily Herald. Again. A radio station. Karen turned off the phone and buried her face in her hands. Upstairs, Harold was still moving around, and she could hear the distinctive sound of his suitcase being pulled from the closet. "Harold," she called, her voice hoarse. No answer. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a mountain. Harold was at their dresser, methodically packing clothes into his overnight bag, the same bag he'd used for business trips throughout their marriage. "Harold, what are you doing?" He didn't look up. "I'm going to stay at my brother's for a while." "Harold, please. We can work through this." Now he looked at her, and Karen saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment. Something worse. Fear. "Karen, you stood there and watched a child die. You held legal papers while a 7-year-old girl's heart stopped beating." "I didn't know you didn't want to know," Harold said, echoing Jennifer Walsh's words from earlier. "That's the problem, Karen. You never want to know. You just want to be right." "I'm not a bad person," Karen said, and she was crying now. "I know you're not," Harold said, and his voice was infinitely sad. "But you did a bad thing, Karen. You did a really, really bad thing." Harold zipped up his bag and walked past her toward the door. I need time to think about whether I can live with someone who could do that. Harold, wait, but he was already down the stairs and out the door, leaving Karen alone in the house that had cost her everything. At Millbrook General Hospital, Dr. Kim was working frantically to stabilize Isabella Santos. The child had been successfully resuscitated, but the period of cardiac arrest had caused complications. Her brain had been deprived of oxygen for critical minutes, and they wouldn't know the extent of the damage until she woke up. How is she? Maria Santos asked, clutching her daughter's hand. She's alive, Dr. Kim said carefully. But Maria, I need you to understand, the cardiac arrest, the oxygen deprivation, there could be lasting effects. Maria felt her world tilting. What kind of effects? We won't know until she wakes up. Could be nothing. Could be memory issues, learning difficulties, motor function problems. It's too early to tell. Maria looked down at her daughter, so small and fragile in the hospital bed, connected to machines and monitors. If the ambulance had gotten here sooner. Maria, don't do that to yourself. You did everything right. You got her medical attention as quickly as you could. But Maria was thinking about the woman who had stood in the snow, who had held up pieces of paper while Isabella was dying. She was thinking about property rights and landscaping and the fact that someone had valued those things more than her daughter's life. I want to press charges, Maria said suddenly. Dr. Kim looked up from Isabella's chart. Maria, no. I want to press charges. She almost killed my daughter. There have to be consequences. At 1:30 a.m., Detective Ray Morrison was called to the hospital. He'd been with the Millbrook Police Department for 18 years and he'd seen his share of unusual cases, but this one was different. What exactly are you alleging? He asked Maria Santos. She deliberately blocked emergency vehicles. She prevented my daughter from getting medical care. Isabella went into cardiac arrest because that woman wouldn't move. Morrison looked at his notes. Mrs. Santos, I understand you're upset, but blocking a plow isn't technically a crime. And Mrs. Whitmore did eventually move aside. After my daughter's heart stopped beating, Maria said, her voice rising. After she died and had to be brought back to life. I understand that. But proving criminal intent, she knew there was a medical emergency. The EMT told her. The doctor told her over the radio. She knew a child was dying and she chose to stay in the way. Morrison looked at the sleeping child, at the machines keeping her stable, at the mother who had watched her daughter die because someone wouldn't step aside. I'll see what I can do. By 2 a.m., Karen's phone was ringing constantly. She turned it back on to try to reach Harold, but instead found 17 voicemails from reporters, 43 text messages from neighbors and strangers, and a Facebook inbox full of messages she couldn't bring herself to read. She did, however, check the Maple Heights Homeowners Association page. The post she'd made earlier about snow removal had 247 comments and they weren't supportive. You should be ashamed of yourself. How do you call yourself a leader? You're a disgrace. I'm calling for your immediate removal as HOA president. That little girl could have died because of your selfishness. You need to resign. Tonight. Karen scrolled through comment after comment, each one like a knife to the chest. These were her neighbors, people she'd served for 5 years, people whose property values she'd protected, whose interests she'd fought for. And they all hated her. At 3:15 a.m., her doorbell rang. Karen looked through the peephole and saw Detective Morrison standing on her porch, snow still falling behind him. Mrs. Whitmore. I'm Detective Morrison with the Millbrook Police. I need to ask you some questions about tonight's incident. Karen opened the door, wrapping her robe tighter around herself. Am I being arrested? Not at this time. But I need to understand what happened. Mrs. Santos is considering pressing charges. Charges? For what? Reckless endangerment. Child endangerment. Obstruction of emergency services. Karen felt the floor drop out from under her. Oh. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I was just protecting my property rights. Mrs. Whitmore, you were told multiple times that a child was in medical distress. You were told by emergency medical personnel that she needed to get to the hospital. And you refused to move. I didn't refuse to move. I was trying to find a legal solution while a 7-year-old girl was dying. The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Karen sank into a chair, the weight of everything crushing down on her. How is she? Karen asked quietly. She's alive. But there may be permanent damage due to the oxygen deprivation during cardiac arrest. Karen closed her eyes. Permanent damage. Brain damage. Because she wouldn't move out of the way. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. And I strongly recommend you get a lawyer. After Detective Morrison left, Karen sat in her living room, listening to the silence. The house felt different now, not like a sanctuary, but like a prison. Every perfectly placed decoration, every carefully chosen piece of furniture, every element of the home she'd worked so hard to create felt like evidence of her misplaced priorities. She thought about Isabella Santos, lying in a hospital bed, connected to machines because Karen had been more concerned about her landscaping than a child's life. She thought about Maria Santos, a single mother who worked 2 jobs and had done everything right, only to have her daughter nearly die because of Karen's stubbornness. She thought about Harold, probably lying awake in his brother's guest room, wondering if he'd ever been married to a monster. At 4:30 a.m., as the storm finally began to subside, Karen Whitmore did something she hadn't done in years. She got down on her knees and prayed. Not for herself. Not for forgiveness. Not for things to go back to normal. She prayed for Isabella Santos, for a 7-year-old girl who might never be the same because Karen had chosen to be right instead of human. And as she prayed, she began to understand that being right about property law meant nothing if it made you wrong about everything. That actually mattered. The storm outside was ending, but the storm in Karen's life was just beginning. Karen barely slept. When morning came, weak sunlight filtered through her windows, illuminating a world transformed by snow but also by something far more profound, the complete destruction of her reputation, her marriage, and her sense of self. She made coffee with shaking hands and opened her laptop. The story had gone viral overnight. #Maple Avenue Meltdown was trending on Twitter. The video of her blocking the plow had been shared thousands of times. News outlets from Boston to Atlanta were picking up the story. HOA president blocks ambulance over property dispute. But it was the local coverage that truly devastated her. The Millbrook Daily Herald had interviewed neighbors, emergency responders, and city officials. The headline read, "Local woman's property stand nearly cost child's life." I've lived next to Karen Whitmore for 8 years, Mike Patterson was quoted as saying. I always knew she was difficult, but I never thought she was capable of something like this. She stood there and watched while a little girl was dying. Mrs. Whitmore has consistently shown a pattern of prioritizing property values over human values, said Janet Miller, the elementary school teacher. Last night was just the logical extreme of that mindset. Even Mayor Patterson had issued a statement, while property rights are important, they cannot and must not supersede basic human decency and emergency response protocols. What happened last night was unconscionable. Karen's phone rang. Richard Morse, her attorney. Karen, I've been watching the news. We need to talk immediately. Richard, I need you to represent me. The police want a statement, and Maria Santos is pressing charges. There was a long pause. Karen, I can't represent you in this matter. What do you mean you can't? You're my lawyer. I mean I won't. What you did last night. I have a 7-year-old granddaughter, Karen. I can't defend someone who would let a child die over a property dispute. Richard, you can't, I can. And I am. Find another lawyer, Karen. Find one who specializes in criminal defense. The line went dead. Karen stared at the phone in disbelief. Richard had been her attorney for 6 years. He'd helped her with every property dispute, every HOA battle, every legal challenge she'd faced. And now even he was abandoning her. At 9 a.m., she drove through the snow-covered streets of Millbrook to find another lawyer. The plows had been working all night, and the roads were mostly clear now, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on her. She passed the spot on Maple Avenue where she'd made her stand, where the snow was now pushed neatly to the sides, covering her landscaping exactly as she'd feared. The landscaping that had cost her everything. Criminal defense attorney David Chen, no relation to her neighbor Sarah Chen, agreed to see her on short notice. His office was sparse and practical, nothing like Richard's polished suite with its expensive furniture and law books. Mrs. Whitmore, I've seen the news coverage. Let me be frank, this is a difficult case to defend. But I didn't break any laws. I was on my own property. Actually, you weren't. You were standing in the street, blocking a public roadway. And, more importantly, you knowingly obstructed emergency services during a life-threatening situation. David Chen pulled up the Massachusetts Criminal Code on his computer. Reckless endangerment, obstruction of emergency services, child endangerment, any one of these could result in jail time. All three together. You're looking at potentially serious consequences. How serious? 2 to 5 years. Maybe more. If the child has permanent disabilities. Karen felt the room spinning. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. Intent matters in some cases, but not all. You were explicitly told about the medical emergency. You were told a child was dying. And you chose to remain in place. That's going to be very difficult to explain to a jury. What about my property? Rights. The city easement laws. David Chen looked at her with something approaching pity. Mrs. Whitmore, no property right in the world justifies letting a child die. Any jury is going to see you as someone who valued her lawn more than a human life. Meanwhile, at Millbrook General Hospital, Isabella Santos was finally showing signs of improvement. She'd regained consciousness that morning, and while she seemed groggy and confused, she was responding to her mother's voice. Mommy. Isabella whispered, her voice hoarse from the intubation. I'm here, Mija. I'm right here. Dr. Kim was cautiously optimistic. Her responses are encouraging. She seems to recognize you, she's following simple commands. But we'll need to do more extensive testing to determine if there's any cognitive impact from the oxygen deprivation. What kind of testing? Memory tests, motor skills, cognitive function. It'll take time to know the full extent of any damage. Maria Santos held her daughter's hand and tried not to think about the woman who had caused this. But it was impossible. Every machine beep, every medical test, every moment of uncertainty about Isabella's future was a direct result of Karen Whitmore's stubbornness. I want to see her prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, Maria told Detective Morrison when he came to check on Isabella's condition. Mrs. Santos, I understand your feelings, but no, you don't understand. Look at my daughter. Look at these machines. Look at what that woman did to us. Detective Morrison had been thinking about the case all night. Mrs. Santos, prosecution isn't always straightforward in cases like this. Mrs. Whitmore's lawyer will argue that she didn't directly cause your daughter's illness. She directly caused the delay in treatment. She directly caused Isabella to go into cardiac arrest in that ambulance instead of in a hospital where they could have saved her faster. Oh no. And I'm not saying she won't be charged. I'm just saying it's complicated. But it wasn't complicated for Maria Santos. A woman had chosen property rights over her daughter's life. A woman had stood in the snow with legal papers while Isabella was dying. There was nothing complicated about that. Back at the Maple Heights Homeowners Association, an emergency meeting was being called. Janet Miller had been on the phone all morning, coordinating with other board members. We need to remove Karen immediately, she told Mike Patterson. The association can't be represented by someone who would let a child die over a property dispute. What's the process for removal? Emergency vote of the board, followed by a special election for residents. But honestly, Mike, I don't think we even need to go through the formalities. She'll resign. Will she? Janet Miller thought about Karen's personality, her history of doubling down on every fight, her absolute inability to admit she was wrong. Maybe not voluntarily. At 2 p.m., Karen received an email from the HOA board requesting her immediate resignation. The email was signed by all 6 other board members and copied to every resident in Maple Heights. The events of February 15 represent a fundamental breach of the values and responsibilities of leadership in our community. We call for Mrs. Whitmore's immediate resignation as HOA president and her removal from the board. Karen read the email 3 times, each reading making it more real. Not only had she lost Harold, not only was she facing criminal charges, but she was being removed from the position that had defined her for 5 years. The position she had fought for, worked for, sacrificed for. The position that had made her feel important and needed and respected. All gone because she wouldn't step aside for 10 minutes. At 3 p.m., her phone rang. It was Harold. Karen, I've been watching the news. Harold, please come home. We can work through this. Karen, I've been thinking all night. 23 years of marriage, and I'm not sure I ever really knew you. What do you mean? I mean the woman I married would never have let a child die over a property dispute. The woman I married would have moved heaven and earth to help that little girl. I am that woman, Harold. I got confused. I was trying to do the right thing. No, Karen. You were trying to be right. There's a difference. Please come home. I can't. Not right now. Maybe not ever. The line went dead, and Karen understood that she had lost everything that mattered. In pursuit of things that didn't matter at all. At 5 p.m., she drove to Millbrook General Hospital. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know what she would say. She just knew that she needed to see Isabella Santos, needed to understand the real cost of her actions. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, watching people come and go, families visiting loved ones, medical staff changing shifts, ordinary people dealing with real problems that had nothing to do with property lines or landscaping or homeowner association bylaws. Finally, she walked into the hospital and asked the volunteer at the information desk about Isabella Santos. Are you family? The volunteer asked. No, I'm the woman who blocked the ambulance. The volunteer's expression changed immediately. I think you should leave. I just want to see if she's okay. I want to apologize. You need to leave immediately, or I'm calling security. Karen walked back to her car, understanding finally and completely that some mistakes can't be undone, some damage can't be repaired, and some apologies come too late to matter. But as she sat in her car, watching the hospital where Isabella was recovering from the trauma Karen had caused, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was going to find a way to make this right, even if it cost her everything she had left.